The war on the Eastern Front was brutal beyond imagination, but for the Soviet women who joined the Red Army, it became something far darker than even their worst fears. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, thousands of young women volunteered to defend their homeland. They became snipers, nurses, communication officers, anti-aircraft gunners, and pilots. They believed they were fighting for honor, for the motherland, and for victory. But no training could prepare them for the nightmare that awaited them if they fell into German hands. For the Nazis, a Soviet woman in uniform was not a soldier. She was something less than human. The Germans considered all Slavs inferior, and Soviet soldiers even more so. But women? They saw them as disposable, as tools of temporary amusement before death. Captured Soviet women were rarely treated as prisoners of war. The German army, though a signatory of the Geneva Convention, ignored it completely on the Eastern Front. For them, these women were not combatants protected by international law, but rather partisan fighters who could be executed on sight. And so, thousands of women who had stood bravely on the battlefield were subjected to unimaginable cruelty the moment they were taken prisoner. Eyewitness accounts tell of women beaten, stripped, mocked, and humiliated by German soldiers. One such story comes from the Soviet writer Daniel Grant, who, together with Claudia Weiler, published a shocking account in 1976. In it, he described a woman soldier who, after being wounded and captured, was hit in the face by German officers, forced to walk on her injured legs and beaten until she collapsed. Every step she took caused unbearable pain, yet she was ordered to keep moving. When she fell, they laughed and kicked her. These were not isolated acts of violence. This was policy, silent but understood among the German ranks. In the archives of the Fourth Nazi Army, a signed order from Field Marshal Günther von Kluge was found, stating that women in Soviet military uniform should be shot and not taken captive. This order reflected the mindset of many German commanders at the time. Why keep a woman soldier alive when she could neither provide labor like a man, nor offer military intelligence worth extracting? For the Nazis, these women were both enemies and symbols of defiance. Soviet women who had dared to take up arms were seen as an insult to their belief in male supremacy and racial purity. By 1942, as the front lines expanded, more and more Soviet women were caught behind enemy lines. Most of them never reached the concentration camps. They were executed soon after capture. Some were used for forced labor until their bodies gave up. Others were tortured to satisfy the sadism of the guards. Soldiers who later liberated occupied territories would often find the bodies of women with their uniforms torn apart, faces disfigured, and signs of severe abuse. Near Moscow in late 1941, Soviet troops discovered dozens of such corpses, nurses and signalers who had been captured, tortured, and left in the snow. It wasn't just killing, it was a deliberate destruction of dignity. But even in this horror, the courage of Soviet women burned bright. Many refused to beg for mercy. There are countless testimonies from German documents themselves where officers expressed frustration that their female prisoners wouldn't plead, wouldn't cry, and wouldn't surrender their pride. One German officer wrote in a letter to his commander, "I have learned that it is easier to break a man than a Russian woman. They do not fear death. They look at you with hatred until the end." Another entry in a German soldier's diary read, "We found a young nurse. Beautiful, she bit and kicked. After 40 minutes she was shot. I remember only her eyes." For those few who were sent to concentration camps instead of being executed, life was a prolonged death. In camps like Ravensbrück and Stutthof, Soviet female soldiers were treated as less than animals. They were starved, stripped naked for medical experiments or forced labor, and beaten for the slightest defiance. The camp guards, both men and women, seemed to take special pleasure in breaking Soviet prisoners. Yet in those same camps, acts of silent resistance continued. There were women who refused to sew uniforms for the German army, citing the Geneva Convention. For this defiance, they were beaten and left in the cold without clothing. But even then they sang songs from home, songs of war, to keep their spirit alive. At the beginning of the war, about 1 million women served in the Soviet armed forces. Around 80,000 of them were officers. They flew bombers, drove tanks, and sniped German soldiers with deadly precision. The Germans were terrified of the female snipers. so much so that they began to execute any captured woman with a rifle immediately. They couldn't stand the thought that a woman could kill a German soldier. This hatred was mixed with fear and humiliation, turning their cruelty into madness. When historians look back at World War II, they often speak of the battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad, but the silent war fought by Soviet women has remained in the shadows. Their suffering, their resistance, and their deaths were rarely discussed, even in the Soviet Union after the war. It was too painful, too raw, and too politically complicated. But their stories, preserved in the testimonies of survivors and in the writings of authors like Svetlana Alexievich, reveal a truth that can't be ignored. These women were warriors, not victims. They were symbols of human endurance against inhumanity. The fate that awaited Soviet military women captured by the Nazis was beyond tragic. It was a deliberate act of erasure. Their bodies were destroyed, but their courage could not be buried. Even the German soldiers who tortured them could not understand how a wounded woman could still spit in their face, instead of begging for her life. The Nazis saw weakness in femininity, but the Soviet women showed them that courage has no gender. Their blood became a silent testimony, written across the battlefields of the East, reminding the world that in the darkest moments of history, light often comes from those who were never meant to survive. As the war dragged on, and the Eastern Front turned into a wasteland of blood and ashes, the stories of captured Soviet women grew even darker. By late 1942, when the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Soviet territory, countless women who had volunteered to defend their homeland fell into German captivity. Some were taken alive from the battlefield after being wounded. Others were rounded up in occupied villages while tending to the injured. The Germans had no mercy. They viewed these women as an insult to their racial ideology, Slavic, communist, and female. They were everything the Nazi doctrine despised. The orders given to frontline troops were clear, but never officially recorded. Women in uniform were to be executed, or if taken alive, used until death. The Red Army's female soldiers had shattered the Nazi belief that women were weak. Soviet propaganda proudly displayed posters of women holding rifles and flying aircraft, challenging the very foundation of German masculinity. This humiliation fueled the rage of Nazi officers. For them, capturing a Soviet woman was not about gaining military advantage. It was about revenge. It was about breaking what they couldn't understand, the iron spirit of a woman who dared to fight. In many testimonies from German archives, soldiers admitted they could not comprehend the calmness or defiance they saw in their female prisoners. Some described them as devils in skirts, women who had traded softness for steel. One of the most horrifying stories comes from the area near Smolensk. A group of Soviet nurses and communication officers was captured while trying to evacuate the wounded. The Germans ordered them to strip, mocking them for pretending to be soldiers. When one of the nurses refused, she was shot in the stomach in front of the others. The rest were beaten, abused, and left in the mud to die. Their remains were found months later, when the Red Army retook the village. The report written by Soviet investigators noted that none of the women had been shot cleanly. They had all been tortured before death. Such discoveries became common. Soviet soldiers entering recaptured territories often spoke of the silence that followed liberation. Not cheers, not joy, just the sound of disbelief and grief. It's important to understand that these women did not surrender easily. Many fought until their last bullet. Some carried grenades with them, knowing capture meant something worse than death. There are several accounts of women who pulled the pin of a grenade to avoid falling into German hands. One famous example is a nurse near Leningrad who, after being surrounded, detonated her grenade, killing herself and several German soldiers. Her comrades later wrote, "She saved herself from dishonor and took the enemy with her." This kind of courage terrified the Germans. In their letters home, some soldiers admitted that Russian women were not women at all but demons who know no fear. But not all could escape capture. In the concentration camps, the nightmare took another form. At Ravensbrück, the only major camp built specifically for women, over 130,000 prisoners passed through its gates, among them Soviet nurses, radio operators, and anti-aircraft gunners. They were starved, beaten, and subjected to medical experiments. Many were forced to test new drugs or endure surgeries without anesthesia. For Soviet women, the treatment was especially cruel. The SS guards called them Stalin's whores and made them stand naked for inspection in freezing weather. If they showed resistance, they were sent to hard labor or to the gas chambers. Yet even in that hell, some of them held on to their humanity. Prisoners later recalled how Soviet women shared their bread, treated the sick, and even sang quiet songs at night. In one recorded incident from 1943, a group of Soviet nurses refused to sew German uniforms, quoting the Geneva Convention and saying that military prisoners could not be forced into war production. The SS guards responded by stripping them of their clothes and forcing them to march in the snow for hours. The women began to sing Soviet war songs as they walked, their voices trembling in the cold. Soon prisoners from other barracks came out to watch, clapping and crying. The camp commandant, shocked by the scene, ordered the punishment to stop. That day the women had won, not freedom but dignity. Their defiance showed that even in captivity, they still carried the pride of a soldier. The cruelty wasn't just physical, it was psychological. German doctors conducted so-called medical procedures on female prisoners, injecting them with infections to test antibiotics or removing organs for study. Some were sterilized against their will. The Nazis believed they could turn these women into experiments that served science, but all they did was prove how deep human evil could go. In many ways, these women became symbols of the ultimate sacrifice, not just fighting the enemy with weapons, but enduring suffering that no one could imagine. Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer who later won the Nobel Prize, collected dozens of testimonies from surviving Soviet women in her book, The War Has Not a Woman's Face. Many couldn't even speak of their experiences for decades. They said that when they returned home after the war, people didn't look at them as heroes. They were seen as broken, as reminders of pain. Some were accused of being dishonored because of their time in captivity. They had fought for their country, suffered for it, but when peace came, silence greeted them instead of gratitude. One woman told Alexievich, "It was easier to face death than to face my own people after what I endured." The tragedy of Soviet women in German captivity is not just a story about cruelty. It is a story about endurance. It shows how strength can exist in the most fragile forms. These women didn't have guns or tanks in the camps, but they had courage. They couldn't fight with weapons, so they fought with willpower, refusing to bow, refusing to forget who they were. The Nazis could destroy their bodies, but they couldn't erase their humanity. That quiet resistance became one of the most powerful testaments of World War II, a story buried under the ruins of history, but still burning in memory. By 1943, as the tide of war began to turn against the Germans, their desperation only deepened the cruelty inflicted upon Soviet prisoners, especially the women. Every defeat on the battlefield seemed to bring more rage into the camps and occupied zones. German soldiers who once believed in swift victory now faced endless resistance, and they took out their anger on those least able to defend themselves. The treatment of captured Soviet women grew even worse. In the eyes of Nazi officers, these women symbolized the Red Army's stubborn defiance, and their humiliation became a way to reclaim the illusion of power, so that the German forces were quickly losing. Reports from that period describe acts of savagery that seem beyond human understanding. In one documented case, near the city of Melitopol, a car carrying 2 wounded Soviet soldiers and a nurse was stopped by German troops. The men were shot immediately. The nurse was dragged into a nearby field. Villagers later testified that the soldiers laughed as they assaulted her before shooting her in the head. Her body was found later by local peasants, her Red Cross armband still visible, a silent reminder of her attempt to save lives even as she lost her own. This was not an isolated event. Dozens of similar incidents were recorded by Soviet investigators after liberation, showing that such atrocities were committed systematically across the front. For the Germans, Soviet women in uniform were enemies unworthy of compassion. A captured nurse or radio operator was not treated as a prisoner of war but as a partisan, subject to immediate execution. Still, many women who were taken alive found themselves transported to concentration camps like Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, or Stutthof, where their suffering continued in new forms. In Stutthof, A Soviet major who had been captured in 1944 was reportedly forced to undress for photographs, mocked by SS officers, and laughed at for her military rank. When she spat in the face of one of her tormentors, she was thrown alive into the crematorium furnace. The brutality was not only physical, it was an attempt to erase the identity of these women, to destroy their pride as soldiers. Yet, despite everything, many refused to lose that pride. In the freezing barracks of the camps, Soviet women clung to small acts of resistance. They shared scraps of food, whispered to each other in their language, and prayed quietly for victory. One survivor recalled that at night, when the guards were gone, they would talk about their homes, their comrades, and their dreams of returning. "We had nothing," she said, "but we had memory, and memory kept us alive." Even when facing execution, some of them sang Soviet songs. One SS guard later admitted during interrogation that it was the singing that disturbed him the most, not their silence, but their courage. Inside Ravensbrück, over 130,000 women passed through the camp during the war years, and 92,000 of them never came out alive. Among them were hundreds of Soviet nurses and snipers captured on the front lines. They were often placed in the harshest work details, given less food and beaten for any mistake. Many were subjected to medical experiments designed to test new drugs or simulate battlefield injuries. Doctors would deliberately infect wounds or perform surgeries without anesthesia. Survivors said the only thing worse than the pain was the knowledge that others would suffer the same fate after them. The SS women who ran the camp, such as Dorothea Binz and Ilse Koch, became infamous for their sadism. They took pleasure in tormenting the Soviet prisoners, calling them animals from the East. Still, even in that darkness, moments of human decency appeared, though rarely. Some German nurses or lower-ranking guards, secretly horrified by what they saw, tried to help the prisoners by sneaking them extra bread or bandages. But anyone caught showing kindness risked death themselves. The machinery of the Nazi system was built on fear. Fear of disobedience, fear of conscience. It turned ordinary people into executioners and victims into numbers. But the Soviet women refused to become numbers. Their names may have been erased from the lists, but their actions left invisible marks on history. By the end of 1943, the Red Army began to push the Germans back. As Soviet forces advanced westward, the Germans started destroying evidence of their crimes. Camps were burned, documents shredded, and prisoners executed to prevent witnesses from surviving. But even destruction could not hide everything. Soviet troops advancing through Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland found the remains of mass graves filled with women in torn uniforms, their badges of rank still pinned to their collars. In one liberated camp, they found a wall scratched with words written in Russian. "We are soldiers of the motherland. Tell them we did not cry." Those simple words, carved by dying hands, carried more power than any speech. Among those who survived, a few later testified about what they had seen. Some became writers or nurses again after the war, dedicating their lives to telling the truth. Others stayed silent, haunted by memories they could never escape. The trauma of captivity was not just physical. It lived inside them for the rest of their lives. One former sniper said in an interview decades later, "The Germans took my body, but not my soul. I am still a soldier of my country." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried the same strength that had helped her survive the unimaginable. At the time, very few outside the Soviet Union knew about the suffering of these women. Western historians focused mostly on the military campaigns and the political outcomes of the war. The personal stories, especially those of Soviet women, were left untold. It was only many years later, through books like The War Has Not a Woman's Face by Svetlana Alexievich, that the world began to understand the scale of the horror and the depth of courage shown by these women. They were not just victims, they were witnesses. Their testimonies remind us that even in the heart of darkness, humanity can survive in whispers, in songs, in the refusal to surrender one's soul. As the Red Army liberated the camps in 1944 and 1945, they discovered a landscape of ashes and silence. The women who had survived were skeletal, many unable to speak. But when they saw the Soviet uniforms, they cried, not just from joy, but from pain too deep for words. For them, freedom had come too late. They had lost everything, their comrades, their health, their youth. And yet their faces carried a strange calmness. They had lived through the worst the world could offer, and they had not broken. Their story, written in blood and endurance, was not just about death. It was about the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. When the war finally began to collapse for the Germans in 1944, and the Red Army pushed westward with unstoppable force, the truth of what had been done to Soviet women slowly began to surface. Town after town, camp after camp, soldiers of the Red Army stumbled upon scenes that no victory could wash away. The air was filled with the smell of burnt buildings and death. In one camp near East Prussia, Soviet troops found hundreds of bodies, many of them women still wearing pieces of their uniforms, their insignias barely visible beneath the dirt and ash. Some had been executed only hours before liberation, others had died from starvation or disease weeks earlier. Those who survived were ghosts of their former selves, thin, hollow-eyed, and silent. When Soviet soldiers offered food, many women could no longer eat. Their stomachs had forgotten what hunger truly meant. But when they realized who had come for them, tears fell and trembling voices whispered, "We knew you would come." Among the surviving prisoners were nurses, communication officers, and pilots who had been held for years. Some had entered the camps as young girls and came out old, their faces aged by suffering. The SS guards tried to hide or destroy everything, but the evidence was everywhere. Blood-stained walls, burned documents, piles of clothes and hair. The liberation of Ravensbrück revealed over 90,000 deaths, and among them, dozens of Soviet military women. In their barracks, investigators found small keepsakes, bits of paper with names written on them, sketches of home, and sometimes fragments of Soviet songs carved into wooden bunks. Those faint marks spoke louder than any survivor ever could. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 1 million Soviet women had served their country in uniform, but the exact number who perished in captivity remains unknown. Historians estimate tens of thousands never returned. Many were executed. Immediately others died under torture, and countless more vanished without trace. Their records were lost, their graves unmarked. And yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Their courage became part of the collective memory of the Soviet victory, not written in medals or parades, but in the quiet respect of those who lived because they had fought. When some of these women finally came home, the welcome they received was far from what they deserved. The Soviet Union, focused on rebuilding and glorifying victory, had no space for stories of humiliation and pain. Many returning women were interrogated by the NKVD, suspected of collaboration simply because they had been captured. They were told to keep silent, to forget. Some hid their scars beneath long sleeves and never spoke again. Others buried their memories deep inside, living ordinary lives with extraordinary pain. A nurse from Smolensk once said, "When I came home, they asked me why I was alive when others had died. I had no answer. I just wanted to sleep." The world around them wanted to move on, but memory does not obey orders. Decades later, when writers like Svetlana Alexievich began to collect the testimonies of female veterans, the truth came out slowly, painfully. The women spoke of comrades who sang before being shot, of friends who shared their last piece of bread, of faces they would never forget. One woman said, "I used to dream of my friend. She was always smiling. In the dream, she tells me, 'Don't cry, we did what we could.'" These stories became the real monuments to the courage of Soviet women, not carved from stone, but from words and remembrance. In 1983, Alexievich's book, "The War Has Not a Woman's Face," gave voice to those silenced for decades. She wrote, not about battles but about souls, about what it meant to be both a soldier and a woman in a world that respected neither. Her interviews revealed a truth too human for propaganda, that even in the dirtiest trenches, women found ways to stay human. They braided each other's hair, shared secret laughter, and wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. In captivity, they clung to memories of love, of family, of the sky above their villages. It was those memories that kept them alive when nothing else could. The historian Aaron Schneer later revealed that when captured Soviet women were brought into camps, German doctors were often astonished to find that most of them were still virgins. To the Nazis, this purity was almost unbelievable. They saw it as proof of the Soviet idealism they could never understand. But instead of respect, it provoked cruelty. These women were treated not as human beings, but as objects for punishment. And yet, their resilience in the face of that cruelty became a silent form of resistance. They endured pain with dignity, showing that their captors could not control their spirit. In the final months of the war, as Berlin burned and the Reich collapsed, the same German officers who had once mocked Soviet women were now running for their lives. Some tried to destroy their own records, others committed suicide to escape accountability. But history never forgets. The photographs, testimonies, and ruins left behind told a story that could not be buried. When Soviet soldiers entered Ravensbrück, one of them wrote in his diary, "We are too late for most of them, but I swear they will be avenged." And they were. Every step toward Berlin, every destroyed bunker, every Nazi flag torn down carried with it the memory of those women who had suffered without justice. Today their names are rarely mentioned in school books or war documentaries. But in the quiet corners of history, their stories remain, fragments of courage scattered across the ashes of war. The Soviet women who were captured, tortured, and killed by the Nazis were not forgotten by time. They became symbols of endurance. They fought not just against an army, but against the very idea that a woman could be broken. The war took everything from them, their youth, their beauty, their families, but it could not take their bravery. They walked into battle knowing that capture meant death, yet they still went. They sang under torture, they defied their executioners, and when death came, many met it standing. Their courage was not loud, but it was infinite. The story of Soviet military women in Nazi captivity is not just a chapter of cruelty, it is a story of what it means to be truly unbreakable. They may have died in silence, but their voices echo across generations, reminding the world that even in the darkest places, the human spirit can still shine.